All right, welcome to the first of what's going to be 4 weeks between now and Christmas on Jesus in Genesis. There's a schedule. Looks like this. It says tentative schedule because I could change it. This is what I thought as of Wednesday. And it might or might not be what we're actually doing. You'll notice, in addition to a suggestion with at least, or a schedule with at least some of the readings that I think we'll be looking at, there are 2 books that are suggested additional reading. One is a novel called The Book of God by Walter Wangerin, who both teaches English and is an ordained Lutheran pastor. He took what he thinks are the most important stories in the Bible, put them in order, and told them in the form of a novel. And it's really fascinating. It was maybe the first way that I started to understand how the stories in the Bible actually fit together. So I find it really helpful. I very much recommend that. The other one is a more academic book by a New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes. It's called Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels. What he does is he goes through all 4 of the Gospels and then shows what Old Testament passages or ideas these stories pick up. That's more academic. It's about 400 pages long. That's short for the stuff I read. You know, my wife used to walk through the living room, look at me reading something and say, I can never tell when you're reading for work or when you're just reading for fun, because all the stuff you read is really long. But that's a good book. There are a couple things that he's written that are shorter and probably very good, but I haven't read them, so I can't really recommend them to you. With that, we're going to jump into Jesus in Genesis, starting in Genesis chapter 1. But first, I want to read some passages from different books and see if you know where these are from. A squib, eh? Said Fudge, eyeing her closely. We'll be checking that. You will leave details of your parentage with my assistant Weasley. It's the first one. Here's the second one. Once Hagrid had crammed all the dog biscuits back inside his pockets, he and Harry followed Griphook toward one of the doors leading off the hall. And a third one. The stag's light, more powerful and more warming than the cat's protection, filled the whole dungeon as it cantered around and around the room. Does anybody recognize those?
Sounds like Harry Potter.
Okay, they're all from Harry Potter. Very good. Okay. Do you know which books they're from in Harry Potter? Do you know what's going on in those parts of the Harry Potter series where I took those quotes from?
Nope.
I don't either.
Oh, good.
I don't either. My kids all loved Harry Potter. I read one book. I said that was fun. and I stopped. Okay. If you were a big Harry Potter fan, you might have recognized those as quotes from, in this order, Book 5, then Book 1, then Book 7. And if I ask my kids, they probably actually know what was going on in each of those sequences. But if you're like me, right, you might or might not have guessed they were from Harry Potter, but you have no idea what's going on. And if you attempt to put those 3 passages together in order and make a coherent story out of them, you're probably going to fail miserably, right? And I think we read the Bible like that. That's why I recommend this Wangerin novel. He takes what he, as a trained pastor, thinks are the most important stories in the book, and puts them in order and shows how they fit together. But for most of us, I think we know some stories, but the stories don't seem to have any connection to each other. And you might wonder, well, why is this in here? Right? What's going on? Or sometimes we have verses that we really like, but we don't read them in context. There's a Missouri Synod pastor I think he's in Murrieta, who I have heard say, I don't know how many times, if you pulled out a letter that somebody had sent you and you really liked the letter, you probably wouldn't read just your one favorite sentence in the letter, right? You'd read, if not the whole thing, you'd read some larger portion of it. And having just some favorite verse that maybe you pull out of the book that it's in isn't wrong, but it doesn't give us a broader view of the story. It doesn't help us see how the stories that we know fit together. So my idea with teaching the Old Testament, and I have taught in the last 4 years, I have taught 5 series on reading the Old Testament, in which I've tried to go at least approximately in order. My idea is to go through an outline of the Old Testament story, start with the creation story, and continue to go in at least approximate chronological order to find an overview and a continuous story which is told from different points of view, and then look at what this particular story tells us about Jesus. When I talk about the Bible being a continuous story that is told from different points of view, I remember one of my Old Testament professors, Jim Brenneman, had, before he was ordained, he had gone and knocked on doors for the Josh McDowell organization. And what the Josh McDowell organization teaches is that the Bible is one continuous story in which everything fits together really neatly. And if you just understood all that, then your life would be better, or something like that. And he says he went door to door telling people this, and then he actually read the Old Testament. And having actually read the Old Testament, he spent the rest of his career working on issues about why is this story in the Bible, why is it where it is in the Bible, and what perspective does it take that might be different from the perspective some other stories take. Just for example, in the Old Testament, some of the stories very much represent the point of view of the priests, the people who ran the temple. Some of them represent the point of view of particular prophets who maybe weren't all that enamored with the priests who ran the temple and had other concerns that they thought the priests weren't meeting. And there are different kinds of literature on top of that. There's poetry, there's history. I don't care whether everything in the Old Testament is literally true, or parts of it are simply stories that were told to make some kind of theological point. But if you wanted to start at the beginning of 1 Samuel, for example, read through 1 and 2 Samuel, and then read through 1 and 2 Kings, that's probably the most detailed history that we have of what was happening any place in the world in that approximately 500-year timeline that's covered by those books. And today we're going to start in the beginning. At the very beginning, I'll over time be going through other parts of the Old Testament in whatever schedule ends up working out. But for this series, we'll be in Genesis, starting at the beginning and truly at the very beginning with the first creation story. So I did have a handout with scripture from Genesis chapter 1 through 2:4. We're not going to read the whole thing, but the parts that are yellowed, would somebody read that first paragraph for us that's in yellow?
In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
All right, so we see here the beginning of a pattern. God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning the first day. If you are an astronomer, you might read this passage and say, well, how did we have morning and evening if God hadn't made the sun yet? You can try to figure that one out on your own. Let's look at that. Let's look at the second paragraph there, starting at verse 6.
Yeah. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day.
All right, we have evening and morning again, the second day. If we only had these 6 through 8 verses, and we tried to use those to explain rain, we might say, well, it rains when God opens up a hole in the sky for us, right? Next paragraph, starting at verse 9.
And God said, "Let the waters of the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called the seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every good kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day.
All right, it was good. There's evening and morning. This pattern continues. When we get to the next paragraph, we're not going to read the whole thing, but when we get to the next paragraph, we finally get the sun and the moon, so now we can explain what evening and morning are. But read that last couple sentences in that paragraph for us, please.
Just read the last couple.
Yep.
And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day.
All right. The next one, we get birds and stuff. And how does that paragraph end?
Same way.
Same way, and there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. Next paragraph, starting at verse 24, how does that one end?
God saw it was good.
God saw it was good. Ooh. Now we get to 26. Could somebody read 26 and 27 for us?
Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals on earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them.
All right, thank you. In the next paragraph, we have, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." Yeah, we don't get to eat meat until after Noah and the flood. I'm glad for Noah and the flood. I'm just saying. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good, and there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Then down below, and God rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. Okay. What do you notice from this story? What got your attention or stood out to you?
Everything was good.
Everything was good, right? Right. Eventually, it was very good, right? After God made people, it was good until God made people, and then God made people, and it was very good. That makes me happy. All right. What else do you notice?
Certain words or things.
Yeah, there are some repeated phrases. That's why many scholars think this story is actually poetry in Hebrew. Hebrew poetry doesn't look like we think poetry looks like, but many scholars think this was actually a poem because of the way it uses repeated language.
So what does it mean to have dominion over fish and birds and cattle if you're not eating them yet?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Tell them what to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ask again, Chris.
What does it mean to have dominion over things you're not eating yet?
Well, you might be keeping birds to have eggs, right? Although I'm not sure you can eat them yet, but over the cattle, milk, leather products. It's amazing all the stuff you can make out of a cow.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. While we often think of the Old Testament as being law, and we think of the New Testament as gospel, the Old Testament also actually contains quite a bit of evidence of God's unfailing love, God's grace, God's mercy. And we can find gospel or good news in stories that we might think at first glance are really about law and judgment. So, what's the good news in this story?
God made a world.
God made a world. Okay, God made a world including people. Okay, good.
And he thinks it's very good.
It's very good. Okay.
It's all furnished.
There you go. Yeah. When we experienced the Great Kitchen Fire of 2013, our insurance company was kind enough to move us into a furnished apartment for a while the restoration people took their time fixing our house, right? Yeah. Being furnished is good, right? We've got everything we need. Creation is good. God has a purpose, and if you go right to that beginning, God creates order out of chaos, right? It's not just nothing. There's chaos, and God orders it, right? Creation in this story isn't being made out of nothing, or ex nihilo, as some people say. The earth was formless and void, or chaotic. If there was something there before that, well, God made that too, right? But God is creating order. One of the things God is doing is separating the water, getting the water under control. Ancient Hebrews were not seafaring people. They hated the water. They hated the water, man. It's like it's like, look, if God created order with the water, that's a good God, right? And you see that in the Exodus story, for example, where God controls the water in the Red Sea, for example. God making something isn't really the point of this creation story. It is the point of some other creation stories. One of the points here, though, is that God creates order out of chaos, turns it into something, and gives it order. God creates light so that there are both light and darkness, and God creates an expanse, the sky, that separates the waters to keep the earth from flooding. A common view that Old Testament scholars have of the first 5 books of the Bible is that they were probably put together sometime around the time of the Babylonian captivity, but they were taken from sources, some oral, some written down, that had been existing in ancient Hebrew culture. And the most common theory is that there were actually 4 different sources for these books. They were 2 of them were probably oral stories. One was a bunch of work that priests had already done, and then one was probably an early version of the book of Deuteronomy, which then was edited. That's probably the most common theory about how we got the Old Testament. And it's worth noting, as I will already alluded to, that whoever wrote this particular poem had what we might call a pre-scientific view of the world. On the other hand, if you go through the text, once we get to the middle of day 3, things seem to happen pretty much in the order that today's scientists think things happened. So the writers had some pretty good ideas, even though they are, for example, probably pre-Aristotle. But they're not trying to do science. They're not trying to do literal history. They're telling us that God created the world. And it's not just any God that created the world. It's their God, not the God of the Babylonians, not the God of the Egyptians. The true God made the world. And every ancient Near Eastern religious tradition had some kind of creation story, and some of them were kind of weird. My favorite one, and I forget whose this is, and I'll give you the short version. God had a headache, his head split open, and the world popped out. That's my favorite ancient Near Eastern creation story. It's like, that's not this story. This story is God had a plan. God made a good world for us to live in. The true God made the world. And the Hebrew stories all insist that it's their God who made the world. And that God, the real world, gives the world order. There's a psalm, I was going to say it's Psalm 34, but I think that's wrong, which has this line about how God bottled the waters up in jars. Rather than the water just pouring out and flooding the world all the time, God bottled it up, made order for where it's going to go. God was taming the waters so they didn't come crashing down on us, or out of the heavens, or just regularly come up out of the oceans onto the dry land, the way that we are experiencing with hurricanes these days, right? But keeping the water under control for the ancient Hebrews, that was a big accomplishment. It was evidence that God had a purpose and that God had power. The first 2.5 days of this story, creation is about creating boundaries, separating light and dark, land from sea, etc., creating boundaries and order. And that order that God provides eventually produces everything we need to live. First, there's order, and then there's vegetation. This is God furnishing the world for us, right? There's vegetation, there's plants, there's trees, fruits and vegetables. Eventually there are animals. It all works together. It's a system. For a period of, I was going to say 100 years, but it's probably more than that, scientists tended to think that the really important questions were physics And if you could get down to the smallest pieces of matter that we can identify and understand, that would explain how everything works. Okay. What we know now, and some of you probably know a lot more of this science than I do, but what we know now is that when you get down to subatomic particles, they don't explain anything. They explain nothing, right? So scientists are increasingly looking at how systems work together. It's more of a biology approach. How do these things all fit together? And God put all these things into this system. It all works together. God says we can eat the fruits and vegetables. Again, only after Noah does the Bible tell us we get to eat meat. Thank God for Noah. But God made everything we need. So Genesis 1 tells us that God, through both what we might call divine intervention and through what we might call natural law or the laws of nature, is at work creating and preserving the world. In the middle of a generally inhospitable universe, where it seems likely that maybe there's someplace else in the universe that we could live if we could get there, but the universe is generally inhospitable to human life, God created an orderly world in which we can live. And you know, we often think of the law as simply the rules that we break, which then points us to our need for Jesus. That's a very good Lutheran understanding of the law. But another good understanding of the law is the natural law, the laws of nature, which God uses to keep order in the world, as well as earthly governmental laws, which also, at least when the government gets them right, helps to create order. And order provides the conditions under which we can thrive, we can prosper, we can flourish. Life can flourish only when we have order. Now, the fact that God created the world, what does that tell us about God? This is where you do my job for me. What does that tell us about God?
He wants us around.
Wants us around, okay. And what else does that tell us about God?
Master planner.
Master planner, okay.
He's in charge.
In charge, okay. Those are all good answers. It also tells us that God is separate from creation. Right? In some religious traditions or philosophical ideas, God is the same thing as creation. Like creation is God, or creation is part of God, or something like that. But if that's true, if that's true that God is creation and creation is God, or something like that, how do we think about evil? Would that make the existence of evil part of God? No. So if God is separate from creation, then it's true that God made a world in which it was possible for evil to exist. And you could argue whether that's a good thing or not, right? But it's also true that the Christian story tells us that God, all the way through the Old Testament and specifically through Jesus Christ, God is at work fighting evil. And God is on our side, right? God is righteous even when we're not. God created order and is always at work protecting order even when we're trying to, I'm going to use this highly technical theological term, screw it up. So God created order first, second, and it was good. Creation is good. How many of you like working how many of you like working in your garden? Oh, good, you can come to my house. I have a black thumb. I can kill anything, right? Okay. Maybe you otherwise like spending time outdoors, maybe hiking in a forest, for example, or on a mountain. This is funny. My wife for many years was the executive director of a nonprofit that did environmental work, water and land conservation. They own thousands of acres all over Southern California. Her idea of going camping was staying at a Hilton someplace near where she'd like to go on a hike. and I eventually reached the point where I agreed with her. You know, as I got older, we went camping together one time. She started complaining before the tent was up. Okay, continued to complain until everything was packed up and we were on the way home. About 3 weeks later, she said to me, "That wasn't so bad, we could go camping again." And I said, "Not if you want to stay married." So hiking, how about sitting on a beach? Anybody like sitting on a beach?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I like going places where I can just sit on the beach and look at the water. I don't even have to go in the water. It's just, there's something very peaceful about that. Maybe on a river or on a lake. Maybe sometimes, although it's hard in Southern California, you can get far enough out of the city that when you look up, you can actually see the stars. I used to be able to see the stars from my backyard. Nah, not anymore. Not anymore. Not very many of them very often. This story in Genesis 1, this poem, this poetic worship language brings our experience of being outdoors, of being in God's creation, into a theological context. The Genesis creation story helps us connect those experiences to God's word. God's power and God's goodness is in all of creation. But we don't always experience God's power or God's goodness, do we? If it rains when you're camping, especially if you didn't do a really good job of setting up your tent, that's not good. When we get floods during or after a hard rain. The fact that the Bible starts with creation of the world and humanity tells us that God cares about the whole world and all of humanity. God created everything we need to survive, everything we need to thrive. Because the Old Testament, starting in Genesis 12, and then the rest of the way through, really focuses on stories about Israel, it might be possible to think that God only really cares about Israel. But Genesis starts with all of creation and assures us that God cares about all of creation and thinks that it's good. The creation story in Genesis 1, and there are other creation stories, tells us that it's all good, meaning that maybe when things go horribly wrong, either it's our fault or part of some larger design which is ultimately and overall good, even though evil is also at work in the world and what happened right now might not seem like a good thing. The creation story tells us that God created order and that in fact it's all good. And the third thing is that God created human beings in God's image for relationship with God, and that happened before the nation of Israel. I have a nephew, I guess he's my great nephew, I guess, named Asher, who, when he was 2, he had learned this prayer, before a meal prayer, that was something like, God made the sun, God made the rain, God made the fish, and God made me. Thank you for the sun, thank you for the rain, thank you for the fish, and thank you for me. But he wouldn't say it like that. He'd go, and God made me! Thank you for me! Right? He got really excited on that line. Right? The world was only very good after the creation of humanity. And just like Asher, we can start by being glad we exist. Right? That's a good start. not only did God make me and you and everyone you or I know, we're all made in God's image, meaning in one way or another, we're made to be like God. It's interesting that God's image is male and female. That tells us that we're made to be in relationship. It's also interesting that God says, let us make man, or human beings, depending on your translation, in our image. Who was God talking to? Who is this us? An awful lot of people think that God was talking to angels or other heavenly beings. Or was God, the Trinity, Father, Son, and God's Spirit, talking to God's self? Is that the us? That's what I tend to think. A lot of scholars disagree with me on that, but I tend to think that us is God talking to God's self and the Trinity present even at creation. We're made to be in relationship with God and with each other. We're not to be God's slaves as in some other ancient Near Eastern religions. Be in relationship with God. Be co-creators with God, the great creator, by caring for God's creation. So we were made to be good. And we're made to be in relationship with God and our neighbors. As creatures made in God's image, we are also creative and made for relationship. So there are some promises in this story. Creation is good. Humans are made in the image of God for a relationship. God made order so that we can thrive. There is a problem. It has to do with the existence of evil. We're going to pick that up. We won't be here next week, but the first Sunday in December, we'll pick up looking at issues related to the existence of evil. But for now, I want to look at a couple other creation stories. If we turn the page, there's a passage from Proverbs chapter 8 and from John 1. I don't think most people read this creation story. I'm sure I had read it before I was in seminary, but I had never thought about it. And then it was Dr. Brenneman made me think about this story. So somebody read the first part of this story? The first three, it looks like 3 verses there.
Oh, I can read it. Let's see. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? And go on to which ones?
Yeah, the first couple verses there.
Okay, the Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first before the beginning of the earth.
All right, so if you had this as your creation story, what would you think that might not be the same thing that was in Genesis chapter 1?
Wisdom came before the creation of the universe and the earth as we know it.
Okay, wisdom. All right, what else? What else might you have thought that was different?
Doesn't seem like it was the first of his acts in Genesis. Thought we did lightness and darkness and made something out of a void first.
Okay, all right. Now let's go down to 29 through 31. Somebody read that for us.
When he assigned to the sea its limits so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the human race.
All right. So if you had only this passage, you might think that the first thing that God made was wisdom. Wisdom, by the way, is feminine. Sometimes translated as lady wisdom. That's Sophia, I believe. And then lady wisdom helped God with the rest of the job. Okay, now guys, I saw somebody smile. Come on, guys, you all know that women are smarter than we are, right? let's just be honest, right? Okay, right? Okay. So was she the first creation, and then she helped with the rest of the job? Was she, like God, a master worker?
Are you talking about the me in verse 22?
Yes.
The Lord created
Yes.
me.
Yes, the Lord created me, and that's what
You're saying is wisdom.
that's wisdom speaking.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's wisdom speaking.
Yeah. So those are just questions. When we get to John chapter 1, this is a creation story that you might hear plus or minus around Christmas every year. Somebody read the first just few verses of John chapter 1 again, where they're bolded for us.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being.
Okay, so in Proverbs chapter 8, there was a creation of wisdom. Language talking about a creation of wisdom. This is part of why Dr. Brenneman says different parts of the Bible were written by people with different perspectives, right? And all of them were telling some point were making some point that the people who eventually decided what was going to end up in the Bible, there was some theological point to it, which was why it ended up in there. It represents different perspectives. Here, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. In the beginning sounds an awful lot like Genesis. Just like the Lord created me at the beginning sounds a lot like Genesis. The Word was in the beginning. So we see that in addition to the wind or the breath of God, the Spirit of God, as is variously translated in Genesis, moving over the waters. Here we see Jesus, the Word of God, was present also at that time.
So is wisdom an entity, or is it a concept?
That's a good question.
Because it's almost that almost sounds like you're leaning towards it is an entity.
Well, that would be a fairly literal reading of it, right?
And
it's a poem, so
right.
It's a poem. So is it symbolic of something? God is wise.
Mm-hmm.
God's wisdom is
outpoured on the world.
Yes,
so to speak, maybe.
yeah.
I would tend to lean a little more towards that than.
Are you asking about Proverbs or John?
Proverbs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is, as Pastor Jay would say, this is wisdom as a person. This is wisdom as Lady Wisdom, often, as he said, called Sophia. So if you hear Sophia is wisdom most of the time in the way it's portrayed.
Yeah, and then I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Pardon?
I didn't mean to cut you off, sorry.
No, that you got it fine.
Okay, so and then the question is that personification of wisdom as a wise woman, because we men need wise women around, is that symbolic? Right, and that's the question.
It's obviously someone's wife.
Yes. Whatever priest wrote that passage is like trying to make his wife happy, right? Maybe so. Yeah, maybe so. Yeah. Okay. So when we get to John, okay, well, in Proverbs, we had this personification of wisdom, which may have been symbolic, may have actually been referring literally to some other created entity. We get to John at the beginning of the New Testament, and we see that the Word, or the Logos, is also present. Like the Old Testament tells us that God's Spirit was present, and that the wisdom was present. I think this is support for my idea that when God said, "Let us make human beings in our image," the us was the Trinity. Again, a lot of scholars disagree with me. You can think whatever you like about that question. I don't think you go to hell if you have the wrong answer. Not a salvation issue. Okay.
You might get kicked out of the church though after 431.
All right, let's go down to verse 10. Somebody read that for us in John 1.
He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him.
And one more, verse 14.
Okay. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth.
All right. And there are some other lists of some creation language in the Bible. We're going to actually talk about Genesis chapter 2 not next week, but the next time we meet. Job 38 is maybe my favorite my favorite creation story. Job says, "I want God to come and explain this to me." And God shows up and says, "Were you there when I made the world? Do you think if I explained it to you, you'd understand it?" It's maybe my favorite creation story. Psalms, some passages in Isaiah. There's a lot of creation stories in the Bible. What we see when we look at Genesis chapter 1, Proverbs, and then John chapter 1 together, we see there's God's Spirit, there's God the Creator, there's God's Spirit, there's God's wisdom, and there's the Logos, or the Word of God. They all serve as symbols in different ways of God's presence and of God acting in history and in the creation of the world. So we do see that Jesus, the Word of God, was present at creation and then came into the world as a human being. And as we read in John 1:12, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. And I have some more notes there, and I'm going to stop. Okay. There are some discussion questions. Let's divide into a couple discussion groups and take about 8 minutes and talk about as much of these discussion questions as you would like. I want to get us out of here no later than about 11 o'clock, but we got about 8 minutes to do some discussion questions. So I encourage you to circle up, maybe multiply out this way. So here's what I'd suggest you focus on, because there's a lot of questions here. You might start with the image of God in church. Did you hear much about being made in the image of God? What do you think that means? Were you familiar with the Proverbs passage about wisdom? And why does John's Gospel begin in beginning rather than at Jesus' birth? So, go.
So did you hear much about the image of God in church?
Heard words, but I don't remember you talking.
I certainly remember those scriptures being read.
I always assumed it meant an appearance, but now I hear more it's about.
We didn't understand these.
Oh, that could be a
It's a
problem.
mistake.
I don't have my reading glasses here, so that's why I'm kind of like this.
Okay, which,
Our
which
whole
question are
body
we
today
starting?
is not at all. Just they were, just
Okay.
God made the world.
I think it was more like, where it says, behavior wise.
Yeah, function.
Function. It's kind
Well, all I remember is the
In my
philosophy.
It wasn't
Humans are made in the image of God.
God wouldn't
Is
like
that
it.
the one?
It's not necessarily
That would
that
be
you're
good.
not like God. It's just that
I think we can do whatever
don't
we
do it
want.
because
Probably,
God doesn't like it.
What about the
I-
first
I
question? What
find
was
it
it
interesting
most
that,
with you about the
only we
creation
were
story
made in the image of
in
God.
Genesis 1?
Not
Is it created out of chaos?
animals.
Yeah,
versus
I
God
didn't think
created out of chaos?
So that's why I felt that way growing up.
That it's I think we're in a
I thought
special
about that before.
level, if you will.
Yeah.
The human
In order,
element,
we created,
a higher
gave us
level.
everything we needed.
That's the way I took it, like we have a higher.
Where did it say that it was created out of
intelligence
chaos?
level, in the image of God being a
I
higher
don't remember seeing,
reasoning
I
and
mean, everything
intelligence
he
level.
created was,
It just says a formless void in darkness.
Yeah, or even dogs, cats, monkeys. yeah,
Darkness and light
Yeah,
is everywhere.
not quite up there to God, but.
No, yeah.
Chaos
The image of-
is,
yeah, no, that's a good point.
this is probably more
Not God.
appealing to you if you're a boss, a management figure, or if you're an engineer, someone who sees the world in context of black and white as opposed to shades of gray. The image is probably more the one that appeals to those that see the world in shades of gray. If there's lots and lots
Go on to
of
the next question.
variation in images is something that's a constellation as opposed to, you know, straight line.
I guess I answered the question
A
before.
yes
the
or
question
no.
was asked.
Yeah, I kind of jumped the gun now.
I think to the ancients, it was probably more
Yeah,
important,
the respect-
like Joe is starting with the chaos theory.
Everything else was.
That really bothered them when
We were.
Jay talks about how they
Which is the only way we
didn't
have
like
been
to
to know
fish,
it.
how they were not
I
seafaring
always
people,
grew up,
that's
grew up
very
with
true, and it's interesting that Jesus'
And I
disciples
remember most about
included
that.
fishermen.
Growing up,
Because that's-
thinking I'm in the image
That's
of God.
kind of
is making me
atypical
special.
of what,
Really?
Being
what
made
you
in
would
the
look
image
at.
of God is
So
holding
the-
me to an
the
extreme.
sea was a bad
high
place, the sea was a scary
responsibility,
place, the sea had the monsters in
That I
it.
had a lot to
You
live
know,
up to.
Leviathan and the
I don't know if
Psalms.
I'm up to that challenge.
So
That's what I
you
grew up
could,
thinking.
you had big storms at sea and it scared them. So they didn't have a coast, so
How
you
do
can
you think
understand that a
telling our
little bit,
kids
more,
that they're made
didn't have that
in the image
allure. So the whole
of
idea
God's
of
image affect them?
being in charge of that, I think, is a plus.
So I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and she's learning about God, and God created all things, and God loves all things that He created. And so,
I don't know, as I get older and I,
being made in God's
you know,
image,
lose faculties and not as strong, more
barely begin
aches and pains and
to,
stuff, I said, this is the image
focus
of
on the
God,
love
and that's for
aspect of
sure.
God. God is love.
You know,
And
that
you're
this is,
created God's
this is what
image.
God bargained
You are
for.
a thing of
well,
love.
that comes with the
Love is the
territory.
most important
Yeah.
part.
It does,
Makes you you.
but is that our image of God? Does that reflect back how we think of?
Trying to focus in on the love.
In other words, we would say, you know, as we're born or as we hit our peak, then we're closest to the image of God.
But they're
I
good,
think that would be
even if they screw up.
a regular, everyday
And also
kind of.
try to be an
I
example.
was gonna say those our bodies
to
were
others
down,
and for
Yeah.
not ready to
image
actually
of
meet God.
to-
Yeah,
Or those are the,
and when you're
Could it be an
young,
example for
when I was Chris's age, I probably thought I was Superman,
Yeah.
you know,
compassion?
not not gonna,
I'm doing
you
right
just
and
don't
wrong.
think about what's gonna happen to you, that, you know, you're gonna decay and become decrepit and not be as strong as you were,
And those are the challenges that we have, and we put our faith to overcome those
or,
challenges.
sure,
The trials and tribulations, and
It's-
but there comes a
keep
point
the
where,
faith up.
It's challenging.
you know, your faith has to
And
be
it seems more
translated into other
challenging.
means, you can't do it on
I
your
think
own.
When we're in competition
You have
more and
to
more with the world.
Readjust,
It just seems like.
You do it as a group, you hire it out,
away
you,
from the church.
you parcel it out from day to day, or whatever,
And they think
whatever it takes. I think
just
that's,
church on TV.
that's the point that Jay was moving toward at the end that I liked, especially
Yeah,
that
the community.
the nature of God showing up is motion, creativity.
The
You
branches
know,
of the vine
he's
are
not,
kind of,
static,
you get clipped away.
not held.
that last
Held
one,
back.
that last one, you know, that humans,
Let's see, what's the
the other
next
ones are kind of, I'm not sure how to answer, but that last one, that humans are made in the image
The
of God.
Proverbs passage about
But how does that
wisdom
resonate?
being present at
And,
creation.
and the word resonate,
That's what we were talking about.
what exactly does that
Not from
Yeah.
mean
a
to
concept or an
the
entity.
question? You're a
I
scholar,
gotta say, no, I wasn't.
Yeah,
aware
well,
of that one.
If,
Probably glossed over it at some point.
if we are of the image of God, we have
I didn't
creative
think about
powers
that
too.
until my adult.
We're not held
years.
back in the
Just-
sense that
You know, it just wasn't anything you ever
There-
taught as a kid.
we have choices to make.
But
There-
thank
we have
goodness, because I
powers
wasn't able to.
physically and otherwise that we can
Even
exert
as an adult, I
to
still
try and bring about what
struggle
we
with it.
want.
But when I think about,
And we have a
wisdom
sense of
being
order,
present at the
whether we
creation, I think of
live up to it or
wisdom as
not.
being the mind.
We know what it is.
And there's God the
You
creator.
know, we have
God the
that
Father,
sense. And we have the sense of
eternal
right
mind
and
of
wrong,
God.
or good and
That's
evil,
what I
if you
equate
will.
with wisdom.
Even if pastor's not talking about evil yet,
Yearly
we know
devotion
what good
on,
means in a general kind of way.
Proverbs, and so I
You
learned a
know,
lot about wisdom, but
we have that,
I
we
never
have that
really
sense
thought
to
about
start
that.
with. We know what beauty is,
And
And-
the fact that it's referred
and
to as a
we
feminine.
aspire to
character.
wisdom. We aspire to getting it right. We aspire
Now it
to
makes sense.
being in charge, and not just because we want to control, at least most of us, I like to say.
Yes.
You know,
Other people like that.
All right, let's take one more minute. So wrap up your discussions, and then we'll report back briefly.
I mean,
At least I like to think that way.
these concepts that
Okay.
are so beyond.
Does that make sense in terms of how it
Well,
resonates? Do you feel the same way, Joe?
And, you know, with the
yeah,
analogy.
I mean, there's so many ways you can tip it, but that sounds pretty good to me. I mean, I'm sure if you delve deeper into it, you can.
I mean, if you're looking at it just from a power standpoint, when you say I have the image of God, I have the power of life and death. That's what Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, don't you know that I have this power over you?
I like what you said,
You know,
but
Any
and
words,
it's obviously something that he relishes.
even on the creation.
You know,
we
he
were
likes-
kind of like,
likes having that.
We wanna know how, we wanna know.
But we would say sure, God could have done it
I didn't see
differently.
it, it didn't happen.
He could have created things in a lot of different
Listening
ways,
to wisdom.
but
I could be better.
even though it doesn't always feel that way, it's just the best of all possible worlds that God created with
So,
it.
the interesting thing about the female,
Knowing full well that we're gonna mess it up.
Yeah,
Pastor says every time we
I say it
confess.
just all the time, have a wife, have a life.
Well, all right, let's come back together and have a brief time for reporting out. Because we're already after 11, and I wanted to be done by 11, because I think that's kind of the schedule this group usually runs on. And I didn't want to keep you here longer than you expected me to, but I think I already have. So with that, what insights did you have in your discussions? What came out of your discussion groups?
Well, wisdom having a female characteristic is, for me, a kind of a liberating thought. It really helps me to appreciate the fact that as a man, I don't know everything. And if from the beginning, wisdom was always seen as a female characteristic. Well, it gives new meaning to the phrase, happy wife, happy life.
Okay, all right, okay. I heard lots of good talking
Yeah.
while you were talking together. What was just one insight from this group over here, and then we'll call this a day.
You have the insight.
We just talked. Go ahead. Joe, you got some.
Well, we were talking about the last one, we were talking about the humans made in the image of God. And basically, we have the power, we're given the power to do good or evil, and and have that force in us. And you can probably go a little bit further than that.
Well, I think from the standpoint of the image of God, we have a sense of what's good and what's not. And we have the ability to fashion things within whatever limits we have, basically, to reflect the good or not.
Okay.
And we choose to do that according to a plan that we conceive and we execute ourselves.
Okay, all right. All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
What's next week?
Okay, next week I'm preaching. So the week after that, we're gonna look at Genesis chapters 2 and 3 and some New Testament passages, at least one New Testament passage.